You know, there are moments in politics that people forget by Tuesday. And then there are moments that land differently, the kind that stick, that get under the skin of a nation because they touch something real, something people have been feeling but haven't had the words for yet. What happened this past Sunday in Atlanta when Senator Jon Ossoff stood up at a campaign rally and delivered what might be the sharpest critique of a sitting president I've heard in years. That was one of those moments. Now, I want to be careful here. I've been around long enough to know the difference between a good speech and a good argument. And I've seen plenty of speeches that got a standing ovation and didn't change a single thing. But what Ossoff did wasn't just rhetoric. He laid down a series of specific, verifiable facts about our sailors, about our money, about how the president spends his days. And he connected them in a way that forces you to ask a question this country needs to be asking. And that question is a simple one. Who is actually doing the work of governing? And who is benefiting from the appearance of it? Because when you have more than 5,000 American sailors and Marines aboard the USS Abraham Lincoln, deployed for over 250 days, breaking records that go back to the Vietnam era, dealing with food shortages and broken air conditioning and mental health crises, and the President of the United States responds by saying their deployment is not nearly long enough, well, that tells you something. And we'll get to what it tells you. But first, let me walk you through exactly what Senator Ossoff said, and more importantly, why it matters far beyond one campaign rally in Georgia. Now, let me set the table for you, because the context here is everything. The USS Abraham Lincoln left San Diego back in November of last year. It was supposed to be a roughly 7-month deployment to the East Pacific and the South China Sea. Standard rotation, the kind of thing our Navy does with precision and professionalism every single year. But then the situation with Iran escalated, and the Lincoln was redirected to the Middle East. The deployment got extended, and then extended again. No return date announced, no port call for over 200 days. Think about that for a moment. Over 5,000 young men and women packed into a floating city in the Arabian Sea, running combat operations, launching sorties, burning through munitions, and they cannot even get off the ship. Families back home in San Diego started speaking up. Spouses went to town hall meetings with the acting Secretary of the Navy, about 200 of them showing up to say, "Our husbands and wives are not okay." One spouse told officials she'd received a message that very day from her husband, saying he hoped he wouldn't wake up the next morning. A sailor went overboard in early August. The Navy wouldn't confirm whether it was a suicide attempt. Reports surfaced of moldy showers, contaminated water, care packages that couldn't get delivered because of the war. Now listen, I understand the demands of military service. I was commander-in-chief. I sent people into harm's way. And it is the hardest decision any president makes. But here's what I also know from sitting in that chair. When you send people into harm's way, you owe them everything. You owe them your attention, your resources, and your honesty. And what these families are describing is a failure of that obligation. So what did Senator Ossoff actually say? Let me lay it out piece by piece because the details matter here. He stood in front of that Atlanta crowd and he drew a line straight from the sacrifice of those sailors to the conduct of the president. He said that while the sailors on the Lincoln are fighting this war, the president sleeps through his meetings, golfs, and trades stocks. He said the president doesn't actually want to do the job, that what he really wants is to build his ballroom at the White House and travel with his aide Natalie on a luxury aircraft gifted by the Emir of Qatar. Now, that's a loaded series of charges, and we're going to take them one at a time because intellectual honesty demands it. Let's start with the policy ground. Gas prices in Georgia have climbed to about $3.80 a gallon, up from $2.91 a year ago. The Strait of Hormuz situation has pushed those costs directly into American kitchens. The Iran conflict itself was justified with claims that shifted from "we destroyed their nuclear program" to "they pose an imminent nuclear threat." And both of those things cannot be true at the same time. That kind of contradiction isn't a minor messaging problem. It's the kind of thing that erodes the trust a commander-in-chief needs when asking a nation to bear the cost of war. And I want to say something directly to the people watching right now, because most of you take this seriously. You deserve more than what a 3-minute cable segment can give you. That's why I tell people to go check the Bluebill newsletter. 5 minutes, real numbers, the timelines and details cable doesn't have time to dig into. You owe it to yourself to have the full picture. But beyond the policy, Ossoff went somewhere more personal. And that's where this gets truly delicate. The Natalie Harp reference. Now look, I want to handle this carefully because I think it matters how we talk about this. Ossoff invoked the name of the president's executive assistant, a young woman named Natalie Harp, to contrast the president's lifestyle with the sacrifice of those sailors. His supporters will tell you he was making a legitimate point about presidential priorities and the appearance of detachment from duty. His critics, and there are fair-minded ones among them, will say he was making an insinuation about a professional relationship between a president and a staffer, and that doing so sends a troubling message to women who work in government. Scott Jennings on CNN called it pretty ugly stuff and questioned the message it sends to young women in politics. Others pointed out that Harp is a bone cancer survivor who benefited from the Right to Try Act that Trump signed into law. Those are real considerations, and I won't dismiss them. But here's where I come down after thinking about it. The substance of what Ossoff was pointing to is important. When a NATO summit in Turkey had to be evacuated under an Iranian assassination threat, the president reportedly left Air Force One and transferred to a military aircraft through a catering truck. And Natalie Harp was among the small handful who went with him, while the Secretary of State and the Treasury Secretary were placed on a separate plane. That's a security protocol question worth examining. But the way Ossoff framed it, travel with Natalie, he knew exactly what he was suggesting to that crowd. And this is where I'll be direct with you. When I was in the White House, I learned the hard way that how you frame a criticism matters as much as whether the criticism is valid. You can raise legitimate questions about presidential judgment without weaponizing the professional role of a staff member. The strongest version of Ossoff's argument didn't need the innuendo. The facts alone, the golfing, the stock trading, the ballroom, the dismissal of those sailors, were devastating on their own. But let me tell you what concerns me most about this entire situation. And it's bigger than one speech or one senator's campaign strategy. What concerns me is what it means for the relationship between the military and the civilian leadership of this country. When a president says on the record to reporters that a 240-day deployment with no port call, with reports of sailors going overboard and families begging for help, is not nearly long enough, that does damage that outlasts any news cycle. I was commander-in-chief during some difficult deployments. I ordered operations in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in Iraq. And I can tell you this without hesitation. The single most important thing you can do as president is make sure the people serving under you know that you see them, that their sacrifice registers with you, and that you are not treating their service as an afterthought while you attend to your personal interests. That's not a Democratic value or a Republican value. That's a leadership value. And when Trump responded to Ossoff's criticism by calling him a Pee Wee Herman lookalike and pivoting to a monologue about renovating the White House, when the White House communications director responded with profanity and personal insults, that tells you everything about where the focus actually is. And I'll say this plainly. You're not going to find this kind of analysis on any cable network because they don't have the time to connect these threads. The Blue Bill newsletter had the full timeline on the Lincoln deployment with details most people didn't even know existed. The people reading it right now are not caught off guard by any of this. And if you want to stay ahead of where this story is going, that's where I'd point you, because this story is going somewhere. And here's why. Here's what people need to understand about what Jon Ossoff is doing, because it goes well beyond his Senate reelection campaign in Georgia. Ossoff is 39 years old. He represents a state Donald Trump won. He's the only Democratic senator on the ballot this November in a Trump-carried state. And yet, rather than running a cautious, keep your head down campaign, which is exactly what most political consultants in Washington would advise, he's running directly at the president with both hands. Now, why would he do that? Because he's read the room, and he's made a calculation that voters, including some who voted for Trump, are exhausted by being told to look the other way, exhausted by gas prices climbing while the president tells them not to complain, exhausted by watching the commander-in-chief golf while sailors can't get clean water, exhausted by luxury jets from foreign governments while their own groceries cost more every single month. Ossoff is betting that the contrast between what the president is doing and what ordinary Americans are enduring has gotten so sharp that people don't need to be persuaded anymore. They just need someone willing to say it out loud. And here's the other dimension people are whispering about, the 2028 question. Ossoff says he's focused on his Senate race and I take him at his word for now. But what he did on that stage in Atlanta, that was a presidential caliber argument. He connected foreign policy failures, military sacrifice, economic pain, corruption, and personal character into a single coherent narrative. That is genuinely hard to do. I know. I spent most of my career trying to do exactly that. The question now is whether this moment becomes more than a viral clip, whether it becomes a template other Democrats can learn from. Because the argument Ossoff is making isn't just about one president. It's about what Americans have a right to expect from anyone who holds that office. So where does this go from here? Let me give you my honest assessment. Trump's response told you more than Ossoff's speech did. When the president was asked about it in the Oval Office on Monday, he didn't address the sailors. He didn't mention the Lincoln. He didn't acknowledge the families. He called Ossoff a name, said he'd much rather do other things, and then spent the rest of his answer talking about the White House ballroom, which is the very thing Ossoff had just criticized him for caring about more than governing. Now that is a gift to the Democratic Party. And I suspect Ossoff knew exactly what kind of reaction he would provoke. Trump's team will mobilize. They've already earmarked millions through their PAC for the Georgia race. They'll try to make this about Ossoff personally. The name-calling is already underway. And the language coming out of the White House press shop has been frankly beneath the dignity of the institution. But the fundamental problem they face is that the underlying facts don't go away with a nickname. The Lincoln is still at sea. Gas is still approaching $4 a gallon in Georgia. The Iran war is grinding forward without a clear endgame. And the president is still accepting luxury aircraft from foreign heads of state while telling American sailors they haven't been out long enough. Those aren't talking points. Those are realities people carry into the voting booth. And if you do one thing after watching this, let it be this. Go read the Blue Bill newsletter. I recommend it more than anything else I could point you to right now. 5 minutes, that's all it takes. And it's going to help you understand what all of this actually means for your family. You deserve that clarity. Don't be the person who's always finding out last. Don't be the one at the table just nodding along because cable gave you the headline, but never the substance underneath it. Let me leave you with this thought. America has always asked its young people to serve. And in return, America has always promised them that their sacrifice would be honored, not just with ceremonies and flags, but with attention, with competent leadership, with a commander-in-chief who treats their service as sacred rather than convenient. What's happening on the USS Abraham Lincoln right now is a test of that promise. 5,000 sailors and Marines out there in the Arabian Sea, doing their jobs with extraordinary professionalism and courage, even when the food runs short and the showers grow mold, and nobody will tell them when they're coming home. And the real question isn't whether Jon Ossoff gave a good speech. The question is whether the things he said are true. And from where I sit, having held that office, having sent young Americans to places they might not come back from, Most of what he said is grounded in facts that are verifiable and consequences that are real. I don't agree with everything in his approach. I think there were sharper, cleaner ways to make some of those points without the personal edge that came with the Natalie Harp reference. But the core of his argument, that a president's first obligation is to the people who serve, not to the people who flatter, and certainly not to the comfort that power affords. That is not a partisan argument. That's a foundational American principle. And I still believe, even in a moment like this, that this country has the capacity to correct course, that voters, when they have the facts in front of them, will hold power accountable. That's what self-governance is built on. Not perfection, but accountability. And accountability starts with paying attention. So pay attention. Because these next few months are going to matter more than people realize. Take care of each other. Stay informed. And I'll see you next time.